Trebor. Uh, it's nice to be at the new school. The only course I ever audited in my life was the year after I graduated from college. There was a great economics professor here, Robert Heilbronner. Author of an amazing book, The Worldly Philosophers. I audited that class. My father studied for a doctorate in economics here under Heilbronner and a great leftist economist, David Gordon. So we have real attachment to the new school. I'm a big admirer of Trebor, who's done amazing stuff in pushing the idea of platform cooperatives, which are important in the gig economy as the workforce becomes increasingly atomized, and unfortunately workers often become increasingly marginalized and powerless. So I think platform cooperatives are a great idea to help solve some of those problems. So you see the title of my talk. Sometimes it seems to me that things are going backwards in time for American workers. I know there's a lot of talk about the future of work. Think of a 20-something worker hunches over a machine in his or her apartment, let's say on the Lower East Side, a few blocks from here, toiling from early morning until after sundown, often making a paltry amount for each piece they finish. Is that a person, an 1890s garment worker, sweating it out, doing industrial homework, paid by the piece without any voice on their job? Or is that a young tech worker working in 2020 for Mechanical Turk, hunched over her computer without any voice on a job, getting paid very little, maybe $4 or $5 an hour? Not long ago, I interviewed an Uber driver in Los Angeles, John Billington. He had a wonderful 4.9 rating. He said that when he started driving for Uber, he was making $2.50 a mile. And then from one day to the next, Uber changed the rate from $2.50 a mile to $1 a mile. And he thought that sucked. And he had no say in the matter. And suddenly his income overnight fell in half. And Billington told me, Uber dictates everything. We don't get any input. It's unfair. Google, one of the great companies of our time, has about 220,000 employees. Only 100,000, less than half of them, are regular employees. 120,000 are temps or contract workers. That means the majority of Google's workers, the great Google, don't have the same good pay and benefits as regular Google employees. Kickstarter is one of the nation's hip companies. It's faced a unionization drive. And just like the companies from a century ago, 3 of the 8 people on the unionization committee were mysteriously fired. And the company says, it's not because they support a union, but I think we know the truth on that. I live on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and I was walking to a restaurant to meet some friends the other night, and right at the corner of 92nd Street in Amsterdam, I see a white panel truck, nothing written on it. And I see 3 guys in back, and I peer inside, and there are tons of boxes, and those boxes say Amazon, Amazon, Amazon. So I asked, what are you doing? He said, we're delivering for Amazon. So I learned later that, so there was a crew leader and 2 helpers. And I learned later that Amazon has an app, much like Uber and Lyft, where you can, use the app to be assigned a day's worth of deliveries for Amazon. So you're an independent contractor. Some days you might have work, some days you don't have work. And because there's so much work to do, the gang leader, and it's like the factories of old when there were, in the factories of old, people weren't direct employees. There was a gang leader who brought his helpers, and they were his helpers. And so there was like this gang leader driving the Amazon truck with his 2 assistants, and no one had job security, no one was getting benefits, and it's really, and Amazon does this to undercut United Parcel Service and FedEx, which generally pay their people pretty well and provide pretty good benefits, but Amazon doesn't pay so well, and none of these workers will have benefits. I've written about labor issues now for 25 years, 19 years as a New York Times reporter, and 5 years since I retired from the Times. And what I'm seeing, I'm sorry to say, is that in many ways, things are getting worse for workers in the US. Many, and for the same reasons as things were often bad for workers a century ago, because employers are hungry to find ways to minimize their labor costs and hungry to find ways to maximize their flexibility. They don't want workers getting in the way. They don't want to hear what workers have to say. They don't want unions. They just want to, follow managerial prerogatives, as they say. And we see with Uber and Lyft and many platform companies, they don't want to hear from workers. They don't want complaints from workers. They don't want organizing from workers. They just want you to do what you're told, and they don't even want to treat you as regular employees. Nowadays, some politicians, I won't name any names, say it's the best economy ever. But in my book, I say that things are very wrong with the economy and how workers are treated. Here's an example I write about. A week after graduating from college, you might have read this. A week after graduating from college in North Carolina, Desmond Anthony moved to New York to pursue a career as an actor. To support himself, he took a job as a sales clerk and cashier at the Express clothing store in Herald Square. At first, his boss assigned him 30 hours of work each week, but after several months, his hours were cut to just 12 or 15, and some weeks he was assigned no hours at all. Working 15 hours a week, Anthony earned about $500 a month, or not enough to cover his $800 monthly rent, let alone his food, his subway, his cell phone. And Desmond had to call his parents in North Carolina and say, I need money to survive in New York. And that's very, very embarrassing after you graduate from college. Some days he told me he actually went hungry. And he repeatedly told his boss, I need more hours. But instead of giving him more hours, his boss actually hired more workers because he wanted more part-time workers to make it easier to plug in all the holes as the schedule changed. So what happened? Desmond Anthony quit in frustration. No voice on the job. Here's another example of things not being great for workers. Patricia Hughes, a licensed practical nurse, came down with severe pneumonia while caring for a paraplegic in Thornton, Colorado. Coughing, vomiting, and with 103 fever, she called her manager to say she needed to miss work for 2 days. Quote, I told him I was so weak that there was no way I could care for and move the patient, she said. My boss responded, if you don't come in tomorrow, don't bother ever coming back. Too sick to work the next day, Patricia Hughes was fired, and as a result of losing her job, she was evicted from her apartment, and her dog too. In my book, I write about something that seems obvious to me, but and obvious to someone who was a reporter in Europe for the New York Times for 5 years, and I'm sorry to say it's not obvious for a lot of people in the U.S. I write that the United States suffers from what I call anti-worker exceptionalism compared to other industrial nations. The U.S. is the only industrial nation that doesn't guarantee all workers paid parental leave. We're the only other nations in the world that don't guarantee all workers paid maternity leave are Papua New Guinea, Suriname, and a few tiny Pacific Island states. So the United States is one of the very few nations in the world that doesn't guarantee women paid maternity leave. In the 28 nations of the European Union, women are generally guaranteed half a year, 26 weeks of paid maternity leave. The U.S. is the only industrial nation that doesn't guarantee all workers paid vacation. In the European Union's 28 nations, all workers are guaranteed at least 4 weeks paid vacation. In Germany, it's 5 weeks, and in France, it's 4.5 weeks. Britain's 5 weeks, and France is 6 weeks. The U.S. is also the only industrial nation other than South Korea that doesn't guarantee all workers paid sick days. While millions of Americans take paid sick days and paid vacations for granted, for workers in the bottom quartile, the bottom of 25%, half of them receive neither paid sick days nor paid vacation. I've written lots of stories about people like Patricia Hughes who get fired because they get sick on the job, or they get fired because their 7-year-old daughter gets sick and they take off a day from work to take care of their daughter, and they get fired for that. That's crazy. The U.S. is also the only industrial nation that doesn't guarantee all workers and their families universal health coverage. That means we're the only industrial country where, if you work in a factory with 500 workers and it closes, those 500 workers and their families can lose health coverage. Same story if a Walmart closes, a call center closes. And to me, that's crazy, in what's the world's richest country. And not having paid vacation, not having paid sick days, not having paid parental leave, not having health coverage really stresses out a lot of workers. And I think for that reason, it's really, in many ways, worse being a worker than in many, many other industrial countries. I'm told that your generation cares greatly about work-family balance. I'm told that your generation won't put up with a lot of this BS at work. I hope your generation does something about some of these problems I just mentioned. As long as I'm in a depressing mode, depressing vein, let me add, in my nearly 20 years writing about labor, I've seen some other trends that are not too kind to young workers. When I started writing about labor 25 years ago, there are very few unpaid interns, except maybe for movie companies or Hollywood or fashion companies. And now unpaid internships have become usually more prevalent and popular. Banks have them, law firms have them, and it's just companies taking advantage. When I was younger, companies didn't make you work until 11 or 12 to shut the restaurant or shut the retail store and then be back at work at 7 in the morning. Those are called clopenings. You close and you open, clopen. And that's become, unfortunately, very common. I interviewed some workers in Brooklyn who work at Macy's and some other stores, and they say they work till 11 at night, they commute an hour and a half back home to Brooklyn, and then they have to be back at 8, 9 in the morning. So how much sleep do you get when that happens? I went to law school once upon a time, 35 years ago, and I remember in law school we were told that non-compete clauses should be frowned upon because they get in the way of the free movement of labor. And we're a capitalist free enterprise country, and there should be free movement of labor. Now, 30% of American workers are required to sign non-competes. And that is usually to the advantage of companies and very much to the disadvantage of workers. I interviewed some 16-year-old girl who worked for a summer camp in Massachusetts, and she had to sign a non-compete that she couldn't go work at another summer camp in town. Jimmy John's, the sandwich company, had its fast food workers sign non-competes, meaning if they're getting paid $9 an hour and at a McDonald's they can get $10 an hour, they can't quit to go to work for the McDonald's because of the non-compete. It might make sense in some industries where there are great industrial secrets, but to do it with low-wage workers, it's just non-competes, in my mind, are crazy. Now, 60% of American workers have had to sign so-called forced arbitration clauses. So that means if you're sexually harassed at work, if you're not paid overtime, if you face racial discrimination, you get fired, you cannot go to court. It has to go to private arbitration, forced arbitration, behind closed doors. And there have been numerous studies that show that forced arbitration usually favors the employer over the worker. In my book, I explain that there are two interrelated forces behind these anti-worker trends. One, as I said, is corporate America's desire to minimize costs and minimize labor costs and maximize profits. The other reason, one that is the focus of my book, is the decline of worker power in America. That's a concept that a lot of people don't think about because a lot of people don't think of themselves as workers. They think of themselves as Instagram users or Game of Thrones fans or Yankee fans or Mets fans or Giants fans or Steph Curry fans. But I think, very different from 50 and 70 years ago, a lot of Americans don't think of themselves so much as workers. And I think that kind of makes it easier for companies to take advantage. In my book, I argue that worker power in the U.S. has fallen to its lowest level, its lowest ebb since World War II and probably since the Great Depression. A big reason for this is that union membership has declined from a peak of 35%, more than 1 in 3, to just 1 in 10, 10.2% now, and in the private sector, just 1 in 16, 6.2%. I was the New York Times economics correspondent in Paris for 5 years, not a bad job. And I wrote about corporations in Germany and Austria and France and Spain and Italy and Britain and Turkey. And European corporations might not have loved labor unions, but they saw unions as legitimate partners to work with to try to create higher profits and more prosperity. But here it's different. I find many corporations don't see unions as legitimate outfits. They see unions as the enemy to fight and crush and resist. And there's a line from my book that many people have picked up, that in no other industrial nation do corporations fight so hard to beat back, indeed quash, labor unions. I'm always amazed at the extent that some American corporations go to in order to beat back unions. Menards is a Wisconsin-based home improvement company, much like Home Depot. It was so intent on keeping out unions that its employment contracts said that any store managers whose store is unionized would have their pay cut by 60%. So you can imagine the lengths, illegal and legal, legal and illegal, that these store managers would go to defeat unions. One Walmart store manager in Louisville, Kentucky, told me about discovering a flyer in his store's bathroom. It said the store needs a union. He was required to call Walmart's hotline, and the next day Walmart used a corporate jet to fly in its team of 3 anti-union specialists to help defeat any unionization effort in his store. I don't know if there was a unionization effort in the store. Maybe one wise guy just wrote on a slip of toilet paper, "We need a union." There's a terrific professor at Cornell University, Kate Bronfenbrenner, who's done a lot of studies about how corporations fight unions. She found that 57% of employers threaten to close operations if workers vote to unionize. 47 threaten to cut wages and benefits if workers vote to unionize, and that 34% of companies fired rank-and-file workers who supported a union. I should note there are, of course, other reasons for the decline in union membership and union density. It's not just that corporations fight hard against unions. There's been a huge decline in the number of manufacturing jobs from 19.5 million to 12.5 million, a decline of 40% because of globalization and automation and technology. Under Presidents Carter and Reagan, there was deregulation of the trucking industry, after the Irishman, of the telecom industry that really weakened unions in those industries. There's been a big rise in the hard-to-unionize service sector, whether banking or Goldman Sachs or hair salon firms or fast food restaurants. And there's been the financialization of the economy, with Wall Street dominating far more. And I think the hedge fund investors, the mutual fund investors really press corporate managers to be much tougher on increasing profits and holding down labor costs. And I should also note, of course, that unions in ways are somewhat responsible for the decline in the unionization rate. There's been too much union corruption. There was a legacy of discrimination against women workers and workers of color. There's been far too much uninspired leadership in many unions, and far too many unions do not do enough organizing to increase union membership. In my book, I quote Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson, who wrote in a book, Winner Take All Politics. No one who looks at the American economy of the last generation can fail to be struck by the precipitous decline of organized labor. While there are many progressive groups in the American universe of organized interests, labor is the only major one focused on the broad economic concerns of those with modest incomes. So some of you are young, you might not remember. So, back in 2011, Scott Walker, the governor of Wisconsin, basically declared war on government employee unions. And he said, we want to take away the right of public sector unions to bargain collectively because we want to save the state government and school districts and counties money by basically crippling unions. What a lot of people don't realize that Scott Walker had another motive, that unions were a pillar of the Democratic Party, and he really wanted to weaken them for that reason as well. So after Scott Walker, got this law passed that really killed most public sector unions in Wisconsin, Wisconsin's union membership fell faster than in any other state. It's fallen in the past decade. Unionization has fallen by 44%, or 177,000 in Wisconsin. How many votes did Donald Trump win Wisconsin by? 22,700. So unionization down 177,000. Trump wins by 22,700. Michigan also experienced a big decrease in union membership, partly because of the crisis in the auto industry during the recession, partly because the Republican government in Michigan passed all sorts of anti-union laws, including a right-to-work law. In Michigan, union membership fell by 144,000. Donald Trump won Michigan by 10,700 votes. Pennsylvania, unions lost 182,000 members over the past decade. Trump won Pennsylvania by 44,300 votes. So I often wonder whether the results of the 2016 elections would have been very different if union membership in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin hadn't fallen. I asked union leaders, why didn't you do more in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan to help make sure that Hillary won and Trump lost? And they said, we were sure Hillary was going to win those states, so we didn't think we had to fight very hard. That was a mistake. A 2018 study by professors at Columbia and Boston University found that when anti-union fee laws, right-to-work laws are passed, the Democratic vote share in various states falls by 3.5%. So Donald Trump won Michigan by 0.2% of the vote. He won Wisconsin by 0.8% of the vote. Those two states adopted right-to-work laws. So according to that study by those professors, as a result of right-to-work, the Democratic vote share dropped by 3.5%, which was far greater than the 0.2 or 0.8%. Sorry, I'm throwing all these numbers at you. So let me give you one more example of how workers' voice is weak and how strong the voice of corporations are. From the 2016 election cycle, corporations outspent labor unions 16-1. Corporations gave $3.4 billion to candidates, while unions gave just $213 million. Each year, corporate America spends just on lobbying in Washington. Corporate America spends just under $3 billion. This is according to the Nonpartisan Center for Responsive Politics. Corporations spend $3 billion on lobbying, which is more than 60 times as much as unions, which spend just $48 million. So if you're wondering why, when corporate profits were already at record levels and Wall Street was already at record levels, why did Congress and Donald Trump rush to enact $1 trillion in tax cuts for corporations? It's because they dance to the tune of those who lobby and give a ton of money, I submit. Eons of time ago, when I was still in college, I read some John Kenneth Galbraith, the great economist, and he was a big fan of labor unions. He said they're an important countervailing power to corporations, that they really help limit corporate control over government. They help make sure corporations share more of their profits and prosperity with workers. I'm sorry to say that unions are no longer nearly the countervailing power they once were. Some examples of how weak worker power is and how strong corporate power is. So a Harris poll found that 55% of Americans want Congress to pass a $15 minimum wage, and another 27%, 82% all told, want an increase in the minimum wage, while only 19% oppose an increase in the minimum wage. So it's by more than a 4-to-1 margin, Americans want an increase in the minimum wage. That ain't going to happen in this Congress. New York Times CBS poll found that by 85% to 14%, more than 6-to-1, Americans want a law that would guarantee paid sick leave for workers. That poll also found that by 80% to 17%, almost 5-to-1, Americans want to require employers to provide paid leave for parents of new children and employees who need to care for sick family members. But barring a political earthquake, none of this is going to happen because corporations, I submit, have such huge control over Congress, especially one party in Congress. And you could guess which party. So some of the results of the decline in worker power. So union membership has declined hugely, I think mainly because of corporate resistance to unions, partly because of the decline in manufacturing, deregulation, other reasons. This chart shows that north, south, east, west union membership has been declining across the board. It's still strongest in our region. New York City is still the strongest union town in the country. Los Angeles is a close second. Amazingly enough, after inflation paychecks for the typical worker have really not increased since the 1970s, while corporate profits are going gangbusters, stocks are going gangbusters. So this chart shows that the amount of income, the share of income going to the top 10% has increased, almost in parallel or the reverse of the decline in union density, union percentage. And some economists will jump and say, this does not show causation. Coincidence is not necessarily causation. But I think this reflects increased power of those on top and decreased power of those not on top. Similarly, the amount of income going to the top 1%. Oh, I should point out, the only time of the past century when income inequality in the United States narrowed was when unions were strongest, from the 1940s to the 1970s. And that era is often called the Great Compression because income inequality compressed. And the top 20%, the top 1% went from 21% of income during that time to 8%. And since the 1970s, unions have grown weaker. We have a more raw, more free market capitalism, and the top 1% has really gone from like 8-9% back up to 21%. These charts show that as unions have grown weaker, the amount of national income going to workers has declined, and the amount going to corporations is the highest it's really been since World War II. And this chart really gets me, and I think it's really pivotal. So from the time World War II ended to like the 1980, which is again the period that unions were strongest, basically employee productivity rose at more or less the exact same rate, hand in hand, in tandem with employee compensation per hour. Since 1980, productivity per worker, what you produce as a worker, has increased 6 times as much as employee compensation. So that means when unions are strongest, basically workers got a fair share of their productivity. Now, workers get far less of their increased productivity. I love this quote. It's one of the opening quotes in my book. And another index of worker power being weak is that in the 1960s, CEOs generally earned 20 times as much as the average worker. Now, CEOs earn on average about 300 times that of the average worker. Some good news. So in light of today's anti-worker trends, many workers are keenly frustrated, and that's one reason many Americans are feeling more enthusiastic about unions. A Gallup poll released in August found that 64% of Americans say they approve of unions, have a favorable view of unions. That's nearly the highest rate in 50 years. I think that reflects, people are pissed off about wages not going up enough. They're pissed off about income inequality. That number's increased by 16 percentage points over the past decade. That's a whole lot. And interestingly, the age group that is most enthusiastic about unions is your age group, age 18 to 34. Maybe one or two of you are over 34, under 17. I want to ask questions. But 67% of people in your age group approve of unions. I forgot to do that. So those of you who've seen has anyone seen The Irishman here? So unions were super popular in the 1950s. They had a 75% approval rating. So then all these big scandals start with the Teamsters in the 1950s. And some horrible corruption scandals involving the longshoremen. I don't know if anyone has seen On the Waterfront. So that's when union approval rate really started falling in the 1950s and 60s. But now you could see it's going back up. Other good news for unions. So a poll that some MIT folks did of non-union workers, nearly 50% of non-union workers basically say, we'd like to join a union tomorrow if we could. That's up significantly from the 1990s. Other good news is a lot of young people are joining unions. Grad students, adjunct professors, a lot of people in my profession, digital journalists. We're seeing a lot of Uber folks and Lyft folks. They're not satisfied with how much they're earning, and they're trying to figure out ways to have a collective voice, collective action. I'm going to talk more about that in a few minutes. We've seen the workers really frustrated or flexing their muscles. The teacher strikes in Chicago and LA and West Virginia and Kentucky and Oklahoma and Arizona. We saw the GM strike. We saw the hotel strikes, the marriage strikes in 8 cities. I think a lot of workers feel that the economy supposedly is doing great. They keep hearing Donald Trump saying how great the economy is, but they're not feeling it. They feel their wages are not keeping up with galloping rent increases. They feel that they hear that their companies are making record profits. I just saw the statistic that Travis Kalanick, who had been the co-founder of Uber, when there was the initial public offering, he made, I forget how many gazillions of dollars, but it would take the typical Uber driver something like 13,000 years to make as much, full-time years to make as much as Travis made. So let me talk a little about my book. So one day my editor at Knopf, Jonathan Siegel, asked me to meet him for lunch. And he said, he wanted to ask me a question. We met for lunch and he said, I'm concerned that Americans know far too little about labor unions and what they've accomplished. And he asked me whether I knew anyone who could write a book, A History of Labor. And I said, I'm not dumb, you're asking me to write a book. And I said, look, I'm not a professional historian. And besides, several professional historians had written excellent books recently about unions, like There's Power in the Union by Philip Drake, State of the Union by Nelson Lichtenstein. But I told him that, as a reporter for the New York Times, I knew a whole lot about the current state of labor. So we haggled and we agreed I'd write a book that would be half history and half on the current state of labor, the decline of unions, how workers are in many ways fighting back to improve their lot. And in this book, I had several goals. One was to shine a light on a problem that I think has gotten way too little attention, the decline of worker power in the United States. I think that when my book came out, I wrote this op-ed for the New York Times, outlining that we're the only nation where workers don't get paid sick days, paid vacation, paid parental leave, and we have one of the highest percentages of low-wage workers in the industrial world. And people said, "Holy cow, I didn't realize that. That can't be. We're the greatest nation on earth. Donald Trump has made America great again." So I think a lot of people don't realize how, in many ways, things are quite bad for workers. A second reason I wanted to write this book was to shine a light on another thing that people are not paying enough attention to, and that American workers are often not treated with basic dignity and don't receive fundamental protections like paid parental leave, paid sick days. A third reason I wrote this book was my concern that far too many Americans, especially young Americans, know far too little about unions and what they've achieved for millions of workers and their families. And I set out to write a book that explained that. And something that frustrates me is like many young people act as if God handed down, the 40-hour work week was handed down by God. And that pensions and health coverage and paid vacations for those who have it, they're a birthright. They're handed down by God. And in my book, I explain, no, the 40-hour work week was not handed down by God. It was won by decades of struggle by workers and their labor unions. And I say there's much truth to the bumper sticker, unions, the folks who brought you the weekend. My first historical chapter is about garment workers right here in Greenwich Village. Who were sick of working 6-day weeks. They didn't have weekends. They worked 6-day weeks. They worked 56-hour weeks, and they went on strike to get a 52-hour week. And they had to pay for the drinking water. Sometimes they had to pay for the needle and thread they used. Sometimes they had to pay rent for the seats they used. Sometimes, the Me Too movement isn't totally new. Men hassled women workers even back then. So in that chapter, I profile a very famous worker, Clara Lemlich, who was a 23-year-old immigrant from Ukraine who led that strike. And she complained that she used to work in her sweatshop from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. and often arrived before sunup and left after sundown. She complained, "I never saw the sun." They also demanded an end to having to pay for the needle and thread. Where did she work? Exactly 3 blocks north of here, between 5th and 6th Avenue, on 17th Street at a place called Lyserson's. And she helped lead that strike because they were firing older workers and hiring teenage workers for like half the price. So that strike, 1909, uprising of the 20,000, it happened right here in this neighborhood, from Houston Street up to basically 23rd Street. And it was mainly Jewish immigrants, but a lot of Italian immigrants as well. And for 2 months, these young women went on strike, and the cops really beat the crap out of them. And in my book, I tell tales where these thugs would come over and really beat up these 16 and 18-year-old girls. These thugs hired by the companies, and the police would come and arrest the girls who were beaten up. And the thugs would walk away. And I quote contemporary accounts from newspaper reporters at the time who saw this with their own eyes. It's just, and this happened right here. And there was this huge meeting I don't know how many of you have been to Cooper Hall, Cooper Union on 8th Street, where Clara Lemlich was the courageous person who got up and said, we need a general strike now. And that became a very famous strike where they won a 52-hour work week. And they were immigrant workers. There's a lot of talk about immigrant workers today, and immigrant workers played a big role in fighting and improving conditions. So in the book, I write about some other important labor fights, the Flint sit-down strike, which unionized General Motors, then the nation's largest company. I write about the famous Memphis sanitation worker strike in 1968, where the African-American sanitation workers faced huge discrimination. They were treated horribly. I profile a sanitation worker, Elmer Nickelberry, who told me, we used to work in 90-degree, 100-degree weather, hauling garbage, getting maggots all over us. We'd go back to the sanitation garage. There weren't even showers for them to wash up. And he said, I stank so badly, I wouldn't even get on the bus because people would move away from me. And he used to walk the 6 to 8 miles home. And fortunately, they won the strike, but at a huge price. Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis. He was down there supporting the strikers. And it was really, unfortunately, his death that finally got the horrible government of Memphis to agree to recognize the union. So, in the book, I also, the concluding third of the book is about models for increasing worker power and improving things for workers. And the Fight for 15 was really, an effort to put the issue of low-wage work on the map. And again, that began right here in New York. The first place where the strike began. The first strike was on November 29th, 2012, at 20 restaurants in New York, 200 workers. The first place struck was on 40th Street and 3rd Avenue. And I was the first reporter to write about it, and I thought, this ain't going anywhere. And I was glad I was wrong. And it became a huge movement, in hundreds of cities. And when people said they were asking for $15 an hour, I said, that's pie in the sky. That ain't going to happen. So now 7 states, New York, California, New Jersey, Illinois, Connecticut, Maryland, Massachusetts, and Washington, D.C. have all enacted $15 laws. So this shows that a really good, smart movement that mobilizes people can really make a difference. The teacher strike. I turned in the manuscript of my book on a Monday morning, February 19th, 2018. And things were pretty quiet for labor, except for the Fight for 15. Things weren't going anywhere. 3 days later, Thursday, February 22nd of 2018, there was this volcanic explosion in West Virginia. Thousands of teachers said, we've had enough. The government's giving huge tax cuts to business, to the rich, and year after year, the teachers' pay was frozen. So some people are going to criticize me unless I discuss the topic of the hour, future of work. So I want to talk about that for a minute. You've probably read about these various studies saying, 30 million, 40 million, 18 gazillion jobs are going to disappear because of robots and artificial intelligence. Two Oxford professors predict that 47% of U.S. jobs are at risk of being automated by 2033. I'll just say, for the past decade, we've heard these drastic predictions about huge job losses and how unemployment is going to skyrocket because of automation. So what's the unemployment rate now? 3.5%. So I don't know what to make of the whole debate. There are these, futurologists, these technologists who know a whole lot, and they say gazillions of jobs are going to be wiped out. So why is the unemployment rate 3.5%? Yes, some jobs are disappearing, but the good news is other jobs are coming. So and I wrote a big story 3-4 years ago where all these people said in 3-4 years now we'll have driverless cars and driverless taxis and driverless Ubers and driverless trucks. It hasn't happened yet. So I think, robots, AI will wipe out a lot of jobs, but maybe not nearly as many as predicted, and maybe not nearly as soon as some predict, and maybe there'll be all sorts of new jobs that we don't even envision right now. To my mind, what really bugs me is, there are all these conferences about the future of work. And there'll be, 3 billionaires on the panel and 2 CEOs making $100 million a year, and then some Silicon Valley investors. But there'll be no workers, no worker representatives, even though they're the folks who would be most affected. So I've talked a lot about unions and worker power. So the gig economy, it's, it's, it is a, platform economy, it is a new type of work. A lot of these people have more remote relations with their employers through a platform. It's debated whether they have a boss. Is the boss an algorithm? Is the boss a person? Are they employees? Are they independent contractors? So it's harder in many ways for Uber drivers or Mechanical Turk workers or TaskRabbit workers to develop a collective voice than if you're in a physical place, whether a store or a factory where you could, go to a bar and talk, or go to the lunchroom and talk. And if you're unhappy, you could plan and conspire and stand up. But if you're 100 Mechanical Turk workers at 100 different locations and don't know each other, it's harder. And as Trevor points out, there are a lot of efforts to try to bring power to platform workers. I have a section of my book about Mechanical Turk workers. They have forums. They have this virtual union where they discuss what they think needs improving, and they try to pressure Amazon, the owner of Mechanical Turk, to improve things. Uber, there's been a lot of Uber drivers. There's about 600,000 Uber drivers in the U.S. They do see each other waiting at airports, and there's been a lot of efforts to organize. Here in New York, there's something called the Independent Drivers Guild, which was set up by the Machinists Union. That is not quite a union, but it is a real association of workers that brings together Uber and Lyft drivers that, to try to fight for their interests. One of the things they fought for was they'd have to wait for an hour or two at Kennedy Airport for passengers, and there wasn't a bathroom for them. And that's a problem. And they fought for that, and they got that. Uber didn't have a tipping option on its app. And the New York Taxi Workers Alliance, which is basically a union for taxi drivers and also fighting for Uber drivers, and the Independent Drivers Guild have really fought to improve the law, to get the tipping app, get Uber and Lyft to create a tipping app. So Trevor mentioned Assembly Bill 5 in California, which is really a landmark bill that was just passed a month or two ago. And Uber and Lyft drivers and many other people in the gig economy, the platform economy, complain that we should be treated as independent contractors. We're really employees. The business we work for has huge control over us. If I was to be an independent contractor, I should be an independent business person with the ability to set my own rates and pick my own customers. And they say, Uber drivers don't set their own rates. I mentioned how John Billington, from one day to the next, had his mileage cut from $2.50 a mile to $1 a mile. So Assembly Bill 5 basically says all these Uber drivers, Lyft drivers, Deliveroo people, this is an example of Uber drivers standing up, platform workers standing up. They want to be treated as employees, so that if you're an employee rather than an independent contractor, you have the right to sue for sexual harassment, for racial discrimination, for not being paid minimum wage or overtime. Then the employer has to provide you with workers' compensation and unemployment insurance. So that's important. Now, one of the criticisms of Assembly Bill 5, which basically says you'll be considered an employee, not an independent contractor, is because it's a state law, and they're not considered employees under federal law. And to unionize, they have to be considered an employee under federal law, generally. Well, I'm getting this gets really complicated. Under the National Labor Relations Act, passed in 1935 to give workers a federally protected right to unionize, that covers most private sector workers, but not farm workers, and not government employees, and not domestic workers, and not independent contractors. So if a state passes a law that says, we think that Uber drivers and Lyft drivers should be able to unionize, then a state can have that power. And because normally if you're an independent business person, you cannot conspire with other independent business people to set rates. That's an antitrust violation. But I'm getting in the weeds now. But there can be a state-backed antitrust exemption. If the state says, we bless these drivers coming together to set rates. So now here in New York might be the first state. Diane Savino, a state senator, is thinking of proposing a law that would give Uber and Lyft drivers the power to unionize, and that would be really interesting. And there'll be a huge fight back by the companies to prevent that. Now in California, Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, I think, have put together a $100 million fund to try to pass a referendum to overturn Assembly Bill 5 because they don't want their workers to be treated as employees, because that means they have to pay minimum wage, pay time and a half overtime, contribute to their Social Security, pay into the unemployment insurance and workers' comp fund. So this is really, what's happening on a lot of platform, work issues is really cutting edge stuff, especially because, some of these gig jobs, platform jobs, are really growing at a faster rate than other jobs. I could talk at length about, various other models for strengthening worker power and lifting workers. There's a great union of hotel workers in Las Vegas. That's, really when Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan flipped from blue to red, Nevada flipped from red to blue, thanks to this union of immigrant workers and workers of color, which is 60,000 members, the Culinary Workers Union. While most of the unions have lost members over the past few decades, the Culinary has gone from 18,000 workers to 60,000 workers, and hotel housekeepers there average about $19.50 an hour, and they're guaranteed a 40-hour work week, $760 a week, about $40,000 a year. They have a middle-class life. The typical non-union hotel housekeeper averages about $11 an hour, maybe works 25, 30 hours a week. That's maybe $330 a week, $16,000, $17,000 a year. Good luck living on that. So, I have a chapter on that to show what a really good, smart, effective union can do. And I have another chapter about some young college graduates found these, created these wonderful groups, this wonderful farm workers group in Florida called the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. These two Brown University graduates working with some Haitian and Mexican immigrant farm workers founded this great group that's really done wonders, improving a lot of 35,000 farm workers in Florida. So there is a lot of hope. Things are bubbling up much more than a few years ago with the teacher strikes and the GM strike and the hotel strike, and the USC grad students went on strike, Harvard grad students went on strike. There's a whole lot of unionization going on. There's a strike began yesterday in Seattle of 7,800 healthcare workers at one of the biggest hospital chains in Washington State. So there's a lot going on. So I'm going to end this way before we do a Q&A. So when I was a reporter at the New York Times, I'd often talk with CEOs and human resources people and people from the Chamber of Commerce, and they'd say, Steve, maybe, we probably needed unions in the 1930s when things were really bad for workers, but nowadays, things are fine for workers. We don't really need unions. Workers have it pretty good, and if workers have a problem, don't worry, our human resources department will take care of it. So I can show a few other slides. So these are delivery workers in Hong Kong on strike. So in my book, I include a quote from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who in ways is responding to this notion that we don't need unions. And Dr. King said, "The labor movement was the principal force that transformed misery and despair into hope and progress. Out of its bold struggles, economic and social reform gave birth to unemployment insurance, old age pensions, government relief for the destitute, and above all, new wage levels that meant not mere survival, but a tolerable life. The captains of industry did not lead this transformation. They resisted it until they were overcome." So thank you very much. I can't believe I didn't take a drink of water in these sweatshop conditions.
Yeah, it's very warm here. So yeah, now we're switching this off, and but maybe I can. So thank you, Stephen. Okay. And we give you this back. Maybe just to transition this into the conversation between Wilma and Stephen. One question, just again, because we are in this class here, which really focuses mostly on cooperatives. We will have later on in the class, in the seminar, in the semester, the president of American Cooperatives talk about very much the same lines, like the history of cooperatives in this country. So 1 in 3 Americans is a member of a cooperative. of a cooperative. There has the history of cooperatives and unions is deeply connected, right? 1844, Manchester. So like maybe something about like this lost connection, perhaps, right? So we see. But let me finish. Like I think like a problem maybe for many cooperatives in this country has been the McCarthy era, right? Which, I mean, the central organization for American cooperatives has probably been in a New School building just across the street here. And before 1921, the logo of that organization was not the double pines that it is today, but the red star, right? But under McCarthy, right, like cooperatives have become very inward-looking and very scared of being identified as communists, right, and have really not projected these values anymore. But so I guess what I was injecting into your conversation is like maybe to try to tease out, and just curious what you think about this connection.
I owe you an apology. So I was running over the 40-minute mark, and I said, skip over the stuff and go right to the gig economy, and I did. And I meant to discuss platform cooperatives, but then I was close up at the 50-minute mark, so I said I better end. And so, as I said in the very beginning, I think platform cooperatives are a terrific idea for gig workers because, if they're cooperatives that are truly worker-owned and run somewhat, hopefully, very democratically, workers will have a true voice. And I think one of the big problems in America nowadays is whether in the traditional economy or the platform economy, gig economy, workers do not have nearly enough voice. And one of the great things about cooperatives is workers have a voice. And second, as I explained about Uber and Lyft and many other companies, there are horrible stories about DoorDash stealing, the workers' tips. The rich Silicon Valley people who founded the companies and run the companies often exploit the workers very badly. I was just coming on the subway here. I was talking to a caviar bicycle guy, and he carried his bike in and out of the subway. He was complaining he doesn't get enough tips. He says he doesn't make enough money. And again, the good thing about a cooperative is the workers own it, and they can help ensure that the profits and prosperity are shared fairly. Now, as Trevor knows better than anyone, there have been big efforts to form cooperatives going back a century or two, and that's been very successful in Spain, in Mondragon. It's been very successful in parts of Italy. But for reasons that are hard to understand, they haven't really flourished in the United States. And the good news is when I heard Trevor first talk 4 or 5 years ago about platform cooperatives, there wasn't much going on, but they have really started to flourish. And I think that's great, and I hope they really continue to take off. And I've talked too much.
So thank you, Steve. I think we'll come back to your question a little bit. So first of all, I want to say that I really recommend that you read Steve's book. It's a great read. It's a really easy, accessible read.
And I didn't pay her to say that.
Yeah, no, it's true. I didn't need to be paid. It has a very important analysis of the today's economic and political dilemmas. He tells really compelling stories, as his remarks certainly revealed to you, and he puts them in historical context. And the historical stories are as compelling as today's stories. And he sends an important message, particularly at this difficult historical moment. So I really recommend reading, and it's a page turner. So it's not a hard read, no jargon or anything like that. But could I take just a minute to comment on your question about the kind of the historical thing, because as Steve knows, earlier last year, I was asked to participate in a conference on the 100th anniversary of the International Labor Organization, which was started in 1919 at the conclusion of the First World War. It's a part of the UN. And the paper that I did was about the labor question, which was a paramount concern 100 years ago. Everyone was talking about it because there was labor unrest, big-time labor unrest, much of it bloody. There was massive unemployment. There was huge inequality. And the answer to the labor question was said to be this concept, a little bit of an abstract concept of industrial democracy, except industrial democracy had a million meanings. And it was battled what it meant. One solution to the labor question and one meaning of industrial democracy was worker ownership. The Knights of Labor, a major labor organization in the late 19th century, really encouraged worker ownership. And there were cooperative efforts that some unions sponsored. Most of these efforts, I think, failed because they didn't really treat them as a serious business. So they failed as a business. At the same time, the American Federation of Labor, which was a rival to the Knights of Labor, was pushing the notion of collective bargaining between unions and employers. They weren't that interested in worker ownership or worker cooperatives. Employers, for their part, weren't too interested in having strong unions, so they were giving their workers some benefits and sometimes even starting internal works councils, which were called company unions. This was a period of welfare capitalism. And so all these things were sort of going on at the same time. And it wasn't until 1935, when the National Labor Relations Act was enacted, that our country adopted collective bargaining as the model of industrial democracy. Worker ownership efforts fizzled. Company unions were outlawed. And so it really isn't until this current period that we're starting to talk about all these things again. As labor unions have declined, workers are looking for new experiments. So worker ownership is again getting a lot of attention. And to answer your question about whether it was thought to be communist, I don't know if Joseph McCarthy really had much to say about worker cooperatives, but the surveys that are done show that worker ownership initiatives have bipartisan support. Doesn't matter whether you're Democrat or Republican. So I don't think today it's viewed as something that's communist. It's really viewed as something positive. And talks of works councils, worker representation on corporate boards like exist in Germany and some other European countries. All this is back in the mix, which really leads to really where I wanted to go in the discussion about whether there's grounds for optimism today. And you've talked about that. I think you set out a lot of the dynamism. There's certainly, I think you and I were baby boomers, so we could say that.
Okay, boomer.
Okay, right. There's probably been more worker activism and community activism in the last few years than we've seen in our entire professional careers. There's a lot of dynamic thought and action. But my question is, will this have a long-term impact? Is it really going to lead to structural change? Is it going to lead to some answers to the crisis of democratic institutions? Is it going to rebuild countervailing power that John Kenneth Galbraith talked about?
That's a great question. So I do think we, the United States, are seeing more militancy, more mobilization, more people in the streets than any time, certainly since the Vietnam War and protests of the 70s and the civil rights protests of the 60s, I think. Because, yes, there have been the teacher strikes and the GM strike, but there's also been, the women's movement, on, the day Trump was sworn in, the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement is huge, the environmental movement, the Climate Kids, 350.org is huge. The Parkland students led this huge, gun control movement. I heard the statistic the other day that 1 in 5 high school students has taken to the streets and missed school in either a climate, an anti-climate change strike or in support of Parkland doing something about guns. So it's promising that people are fed up and they become more militant. They're standing up more than I think was the case 5 and 10 and 20 years ago. Now, on the other side, as I said, corporate power is very, 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 very strong. And the guy in the White House and the people in control of the Senate, they don't want to give workers power. They don't want to, help the Black Lives Matter movement or the climate movement or the gun control movement. They're firmly in control. And they're trying to reduce, make sure fewer young people vote, make sure fewer African Americans vote. They're like doing everything they can to cling to power. So the question is whether all these good, healthy democratic movements, and I should talk about the immigrant movement and then the DACA movement, the dreamer. There's just a whole lot bubbling up of healthy democratic empowerment movements can somehow overcome the corporate power, the Donald Trump, the Mitch McConnell, the GOP hold that's like holding down so many people. I'm much more optimistic now in many ways than I was a few years ago. But when you can't even get the Senate to vote to call witnesses in the impeachment, it just shows that our system is really, really, really broken, and I pray it can be fixed.
I asked the question because I had a very interesting exchange in the last year with a young union organizer, strategist. I say young, he's 43, probably that's old to some of you. But we had an interesting exchange, and he said he worries about the narrative of labor in decline and how Americans want to be on the winning team. And he said the labor movement doesn't seem like the winning team, and he's in the labor movement. And he mentions the teacher strikes, the Marriott strike, the fight for 15. He said, but these victories are still too sporadic to counter the negative narrative, and nothing wins like winning in America. And then he went on and he drew a distinction between the labor movement and the Extinction Rebellion. That's something that we didn't know what it was. Some of you may know. British, I think it's around climate change, environmental change. And he says the distinction in terms of their names, their sense of urgent purpose, and their vibrancy. And he says in the name Extinction Rebellion makes it viscerally present that nothing less than death, and even mass death, is at stake. And he said the name conveys the urgency, the intensity, and then their actions are creative, militant, powerful, seem to flow from this urgency, and people respond. And he said somehow the labor movement has become a lumbering bureaucracy, lacking urgency or intensity, bureaucratic at its core. He said, I'm talking about something more than just a rebrand. He said the name Extinction Rebellion flows from its activist sense of mission, their duty to fight the destruction of the planet. And he said, I feel that same sense of purpose around my work, and I know that some of my comrades around the world do as well. But he said, somehow we're a bit stuck in the mire of a dying 100-year-old movement, which is barely a movement. What do you think?
What an easy question to answer. Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, I talk to a lot of workers on the ground, and, what this, middle-level labor official said is insightful, well-informed, but I think a lot of workers who feel they're being screwed day to day, they want immediate help. They want something. And, so in my book, the first big person I profiled, Terrence Wise, he's a fast food worker in Kansas City. And I talk about how he leaves the house. He has two full-time jobs. He leaves the house at 6 a.m., hour commute to his job at Burger King. He's there from 7 to 3, takes another hour bus commute. Then he goes to Taco Bell, and he works till 11 midnight. He gets home at 1 in the morning. He has 3 daughters. He doesn't see them because they wake up after he leaves for work and go to sleep before he comes home. And so he, the fight for 15 began, he was all in right away. This sucks, my life sucks, pay sucks, we got to do something. Yes, he knew very well, he's African American, he knew very well about the discrimination, the horrible discrimination in the labor movement, but he also, knew about how much Dr. King, backed the labor movement, how, about the great history of A. Philip Randolph and how he was a great African American union leader. So, yeah, on a certain level, they realize there are lots of things wrong with the labor movement. On the other hand, they say, what's the best way to lift ourselves now? So, I also write about the 2 teachers who got the ball rolling for the West Virginia teacher strike, which really got the ball rolling for everything else, Oklahoma, Kentucky, Arizona. Emily Comer was 24 years old. She just got, finished getting a master's in Spanish, in education in Spanish, to teach Spanish, $70,000 in college debt, getting paid $38,000 a year. West Virginia ranked 48th in teacher pay in the nation, average pay $45,000. The governor, the richest person in West Virginia, gives his big State of the State address and says, guess what, government employees, I'm going to be generous and give you a 1% raise a year for the next 5 years. And Emily Comer and this person, she was with Jay O'Neill, who was an English teacher, just moved from Pennsylvania. they said, this is crazy. And they realized that there were problems with the two big teacher unions in West Virginia, the American Federation of Teachers and the National Education Association. They were fighting with each other. They weren't mobilized people enough. They weren't involving workers enough. And these two people really founded the website that got the ball rolling for this huge strike. And they realized there are problems with the labor movement, but they said, we have immediate problems. Thousands of other teachers have immediate problems, and we got to do something. And they built their own movement. And it's kind of for the larger, old style labor movement to figure out, there's this great momentum and energy and thousands of people taking to the streets. How do we handle that? Now in Arizona, in contrast, again, it was founded by some young people. Noah Carvelis, 23 years old. He had just gotten a music degree from the University of Illinois. He was in his second year teaching, making like $38,000 a year. And he saw what happened in West Virginia. He was on the phone with the people in West Virginia, and he was the one who started the website. The teachers in Arizona hadn't gotten an across-the-board raise in 10 years. While again, there were huge tax cuts for corporations and the rich, and he saw that the Facebook movement page really took off, but they wanted the backing of organized labor. So the teachers union worked behind the scenes and provided them with money. And it was a great example of old labor and new labor doing a great job working together.
So there's a really interesting book, if you haven't read it, that I recommend called Twitter and Tear Gas. And the author, Zeynep Tufekci, analyzes a lot of the social media movements worldwide. And one of the things she talks about is that they're leaderless, they're horizontal, they're structureless. And that can be problematic because they don't have mechanisms for resolving disputes. They don't have an organized structure. But I think what you've talked about with the school strikes is that the social media movements complemented by the structures, existing structures and organization of the labor movement, maybe is a very good combination.
Yeah. So in Oklahoma, there was the second big strike. And again, founded by a 27-year-old Hispanic history teacher. And again, he was watching TV, seeing what was happening in West Virginia, said, well, we can do that too. And he started it. And they were much more militant than the old-fashioned teachers union. And the teachers union was much less supportive. The Arizona teachers union was really smart and much more supportive. But at one point, the legislature had already given a $10,000 raise to teachers. And the union leaders said, this is all we're going to get, folks. You got to, and the Republican legislature, which had cut taxes, every year for the past 10 years, had raised taxes and given a $10,000 raise. And the Facebook people wanted to stay out. And there was real tension where the teachers union leaders said, you have to get real. This is a very red state, and you're not going to get more blood from this stone. So, it was interesting. In Arizona, there was wonderful cooperation between the union and the Facebook folks, and Oklahoma, not so much.
Yeah, interesting. So we want to leave time for your discussion, but I want to just ask one more or two-part question. And it goes back to my question of, are you optimistic? Is there grounds for hope? But this time I'm going to focus not on worker activism, but on corporate governance. So last year, the Business Roundtable, and this is something you mentioned in your book, the Business Roundtable published a statement on the purpose of a corporation that was signed by 181 CEOs that announced a move away from the shareholder primacy model to a commitment to all stakeholders, including employees and the community. There have been mixed reactions to whether this is something real. Is it really going to happen? Are we really going to shift away from the heavy Wall Street emphasis on the shareholder? And so what do you think? Is this real? Is it going to happen? Are billionaires getting nervous? And so that's the first part of my question. And the second part of the question, this comes back to Trevor, is do you see the platform cooperative model with democratic ownership and democratic governance as an alternative to the shareholder myth, to the shareholder primacy model, as an alternative to some of the perils of big technology that are being scrutinized today, and to the perils of unregulated capitalism? Another small
in
question.
10 words or less. Thanks. Good. So, it sounded nice when the Business Roundtable, the association of like the 200 CEOs of the 200 largest corporations said, we are no longer going to be so obsessed with profit maximization, with the notion that only shareholders matter. We're going to care about other stakeholders, meaning communities and the environment and workers. But I really haven't seen them act on that. I haven't seen them do anything, go out of the way to make life easier for workers. I think Walmart, and I'm famous for criticizing Walmart, but I think Walmart a few days after that announced it was going to stop selling ammunition for assault rifles. That was interesting for. That was noble for. Noble's a big word. It was certainly the right thing to do. But I think maybe Walmart's CEO was thinking, well, maybe we could act a little more in the public interest. But I haven't seen many other examples. So I think the Business Roundtable.
CEOs have cut their pay as a result.
Right. The Business Roundtable, I think, saw how humongously embarrassing it is, the opiate crisis, and some of the nation's most prestigious pharmaceutical companies were just caught with their pants down doing all sorts of horrendous thing to push opiates on people. And Exxon was fraudulently denying climate change. And I think they were scared that so many young people were huge Bernie Sanders fans and Elizabeth Warren fans. And public polls showing that young Americans are more critical of capitalism than of socialism. So I think at a minimum, it didn't hurt them to say, we're not going to focus so much on profits, but I haven't really seen a follow-up. So as I was saying, I think platform cooperatives can be a very good response to this often exploitative, platform gig economy where workers have little voice and are often taken advantage of. I think one of the biggest, and again, you're the expert, a big problem that platform cooperatives need to surmount is getting a lot of capital to be founded and expand. And a lot of the startups are founded by Silicon Valley gazillionaires who want to invest and make a lot of money. It would be great if, really enlightened capitalists like, maybe George Soros or who knows, billionaires, maybe instead of Tom Steyer and Mike Bloomberg pissing away all their money running for president, they could invest, they could give money to platform cooperatives and lend money. I think that's one of the problems cooperatives have faced over the years, is getting the money to go to scale to really cooperate with the big established corporations. So,
and I might suggest also that I think for the money people to do that, they have to be convinced of the successes. And part of that is your profession, the stories of it, getting the stories of successes out there. So great presentation,
Thank
Steve. You really just covered an enormous amount of material. And I think we want to turn this over for discussion with the audience.
No, this is the moment when I thank the speakers and just end the public part of it. So we can cut the live stream off and welcome you back next week for Lizzie O'Shea with a focus on tech workers. But so Julie will